All right, guys, so this is going to start our social studies for today. And this is where we're going to be finishing. And basically, at this point, the Civil War, things are coming to a head, and the Civil War is about to start. It is about to happen. So, we are going to read a reading passage called The War Begins. All right. Change and a new government. After Lincoln was elected president in 1860, the tensions between the North and the South could no longer be ignored. Many Southerners felt that the time had come to take action and secede or break away from the United States. In December 1860, only 2 months after Lincoln was elected, South Carolina led the charge and decided to secede. So, South Carolina was the very first state that pulled away from the Union. It didn't take long before the other southern states followed. By February 1st, 1861, six more states, including Alabama, Florida, Mississippi, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas, had separated themselves from the United States. These seven total states formed their own government on February 8th. It was called the Confederate States of America, often referred to as the Confederacy. They even created their own constitution, which clearly supported states' rights and slavery. The Confederacy elected Jefferson Davis as their president. Davis had once served as a senator from Mississippi, a slave state. Now he was president of a new country. President Lincoln had a real problem on his hands. By the time Lincoln had been officially sworn into office in March of 1861, the Confederacy had taken control of most military forts and property in the South. One of the only forts still under control of the Union or states loyal to the United States was Fort Sumter. This fort was located in the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina. The first shots are fired. Jefferson Davis made plans to meet with his advisors to discuss Fort Sumter. Davis wanted to take control of the fort and bring it under Confederate control. Davis sent officers to ask for the Union to surrender the fort. Robert Anderson, the Union officer in charge of the fort, agreed to surrender the fort if the Confederacy would wait 3 days. The Confederacy was not willing to wait and warned the Union that they would begin firing shots on the fort if they did not surrender within 1 hour. Early in the morning on Friday, April 12th, the Confederates began firing on Fort Sumter and continued bombing into Saturday. The Union officers were not prepared for such an attack and were forced to surrender and leave the fort. After hearing about the attack, Lincoln called for 75,000 Union soldiers to fight back. Lincoln's request for troops angered the states of Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina. This brought the total number of Confederate states to 11. Only 23 states were left in the Union. Although not every state in the Union was ready to fight, four Union states, Delaware, Maryland, Missouri, and Kentucky, had been slave states and were unsure about whether or not to stay with the Union. These states became known as the border states because they were located between the Confederacy and the Union. Later on in the war, West Virginia broke away from Virginia, a Confederate state. West Virginia voted to stay in the Union when it became its own state in 1863. There were then a total of five border states. Some of these states decided to stay in the Union, but would provide soldiers to the Union Army. Lincoln allowed these border states to stay in the Union even though they were slave states because his main goal was to keep the United States together. This means war. The firing on Fort Sumter was the beginning of the Civil War. When Lincoln first sent men to fight for the Union Army, he estimated that the soldiers would only be needed for 90 days. Little did he know that this war would be longer and shed more blood than anyone could have ever imagined. All right, so let's look. This is going to be your activity for today. You're going to have to include information about Fort Sumter and complete a graphic organizer. So let's go through our PowerPoint. Your learning target for today is being able to explain why the South broke away from the Union. So the biggest deciding factor in the South breaking away from the Union is slavery because they absolutely 100% did not agree that Abraham Lincoln was trying to abolish slavery. They felt that it disturbed their livelihood and they were willing to fight for it. All right, so the Union and the Confederacy. So the Union states are green, it's dark green. The Union territories are this light green, which means they aren't technically states yet, but President Lincoln still owns them. And then these yellow states were what became the border states, and some chose to be slave states and some chose to be free states. And then all of the orange are the Confederate states. All right, so who has the advantage? The population, the total population, blue is north and red is south. So who has more population? Definitely the north. Who has more factories? The north. Who has more soldiers? The north. Who has more states? The north. Who has more railroads? The north. So even though the South knew that the North had this huge advantage, they still decided to fire upon Fort Sumter because of slavery. A war strategy is a set of ideas that each side of a war will use to help them win. Both the Union and Confederate armies believed that they could win the war with their strategy. All right. The Union had a war strategy made up of three parts. They had the blockade, the capture, and the surround. So the blockade is done by shutting off an area to keep people and supplies from moving in and out. Okay, so it's kind of what King George did during the American Revolution when he shut down the Boston Harbor. That was kind of like a blockade, okay? So then they have the capture, and the Union planned to capture territory along the Mississippi River, which was a central area in the Confederacy because that river runs all the way from the north to the south. And then being able to surround is called the Anaconda Plan. And this means you'll be able to attack them from all sides. So you won't have to worry about um, them being able to escape, basically. Okay, so the South strategy was defense. They planned on defense the whole time because they knew they had less soldiers, they knew they had less population, they knew they had less resources. So they were going to have to be on defense mode. And they also asked for help from Great Britain. Make sure you go back and read this because that's pretty important. All right, so go back and answer your questions on your slides here. And if you need any help, contact